Lo que nos trae aquí es discutir el tema de economía de la cultura, el desarrollo sustentable y la diversidad de las expresiones culturales. Que desde 1982 hay una muy clara búsqueda de relacionar cultura con desarrollo sustentable. Se mencionaba a las industrias culturales en el camino, pero pareciera que de repente estos dos temas que eran muy sólidos, muy importantes, cultura y desarrollo sustentable, se ven interrumpidos por la emergencia de este nuevo concepto de industrias creativas, de economía de la cultura. ¿Qué pasó en este camino? ¿Qué pasó en esta visión de cultura y desarrollo que estaba tan bien cimentada que de repente se desestabilizó de esta manera?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question that's difficult to answer, but yet in trying to answer it, you can cover a lot of ground. The first thing I would say is that this link between culture and sustainable development, quite frankly, is more of a slogan, and it has never been more of a slogan than anything else, because what I'm saying is related to how you interpret the notion of sustainable development. My preference is to interpret sustainable development in the same way as the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, interpreted it, which is a mode of exploiting the natural resources of the world, the ecological resources of the world, in a way that doesn't deplete them for future generations. You're handing down, if not more, then at least the same. You are in a framework of intra-generational equity. Now, what has happened with this word sustainable, sostenible, it's come to mean anything that can be sustained, that can continue, that is viable. And in that sense, sustainable development is an empty concept. So what are you really talking about? Are you saying that, because if you're saying that development can become unsustainable because you're depleting resources, then you're going, back to the original sense. So what I would say to you is that the 1982 Mexico conference, Mundial, really focused on the relationship between culture and development, which was understood as a project of affirmation of the non-West. Since the West had been the colonizing imperial power, and since culture had been defined up to that point very largely in the narrower arts and culture sense, as it was employed in those years by Europe and North America, the key stake in Mexico City was to say culture is more, hence the adoption of an anthropological concept.
Yes.
And that wasn't exactly thought through to its logical conclusion. The point of that broader concept was to say, nosotros también tenemos cultura. But it's not Mona Lisa, it's not Mozart. But our cultures, our oral traditions, our folk music, our crafts traditions are just as valid as cultural manifestations, as cultural expressions, as the high art of the West is. And that was the battle that was fought and established in Mexico. And we know what happened to that kind of third world ideology, as a matter of fact, because within 10 years, there was no longer a third world. There wasn't a second world. That is, yes. Communism collapsed. Communism collapsed, and the neoliberal capitalist order became the reigning order of the world. And it's also at that moment that what began to happen was that politicians, notably at the local level, and policymakers in the West realized that the cultural was a huge productive sector, that cinema, book production, the media, all of these processes which became known, which were already known, by the way, in 1982 as the cultural industries, they became redefined for purposes that were linked to very specific political objectives, notably in the United Kingdom. They were redefined as creative industries, partly because by having a broader definition than cultural, you could include computer software, video games, a lot of products and services that would not normally be considered cultural.
Yes.
But by including them, and because of their considerable value, you were able to argue the cultural sector is a very important sector of the economy, and you should be taking note of it. So it was an opportunistic.
And to add a sense of importance,
Right.
of newness,
Exactly.
of
Exactly.
something that is being creative, being
Right.
new,
Right.
instead of the traditional
Right.
heritage
Right.
that has driven the future
Right.
that was being lived in that moment.
Absolutely.
But okay, but if you agree with me, when we review the contents of the cultural economy as defined in the report, there are very specific things included in that. When we talk about creative economy in the third world, in Mexico or in Latin America, the people think that, for example, gastronomy, clothes, traditional clothes, festivals are included in that economy, and mainly that's not true. We are including in that measurement, in that concept, mainly the media, mainly the publishing, and we are adding the design as part of this creative economy. But the concept has exploded, and I think that in certain moments it has covered all the discussion, and now we are not talking about cultural policies, but how to deal with the cultural economy, how to manage the cultural economy.
But that has become, when the cultural economy is a big component of the economy and employs a lot of people and has an impact on the lives of a lot of people, managing it, promoting it, fostering it, getting it to flourish in many different manifestations. That is, the definitions that you will have in Western Europe will not be the same as the definitions in Mexico or the definitions in Brazil or the definitions in India. Some of the countries I've named might even not use the term very much. India does not use the term creative economy or creative industries. Its policymakers are not interested in that particular term, but that again is linked to very specific historical reasons in India. But coming back to your question, I believe that the management of that sector has become a central cultural policy issue. Why? Simply because so many of the cultural products, services, and processes that we consume today, that we take part in today, that we have access to today, are distributed in industrial or digital forms. That is, there is the access to cultural expression is not simply the village square anymore.
Oh, yes.
It is the village square, but in the sense of the global village square, and the vector for that is the internet, or DVDs, or whatever, all of the technologically vectored goods and services.
The new meaning pack. That is. Okay, but in this sense, what happens with the culture that is not included in the so-called creative industries? For example, the classics, for example, the heritage, that suddenly all of them turned old.
Right. Well, heritage is included. I think what you'll find is the definitions are very imperialistic, so that heritage is included. The creative economy has become an umbrella term for everything. And the point is not to necessarily reject it as an umbrella term, but to say there are ways in which the cultural economy plays out, ways in which it exists. It is conjugated in many different ways in different countries of the world, and then that is the key message of the report, which is in many non-Western settings, developing the cultural economy may not be a question of developing anything digital, despite what I said a few minutes ago. It may be a question of developing the crafts. It is certainly a question of heritage. It is certainly a question of the renewal and continued vitality of traditions, oral traditions, everything that we call intangible heritage can be transformed very easily into cultural expression. Okay. And that is the challenge.
But this takes me to the last part, or the last question because of the time. The indicators. I agree that these other themes are included, mainly in its relation to development. As you told us yesterday, they are part of the first part of the inform. But indicators, what happens with them?
Well, I think we need to step back and say, what are we defining as development? Because one of the conceits of the culture and development discourse is that we're defining development differently according to our culture. And I think that's a very doubtful proposition. I'm not sure that we're actually doing that. What we're actually saying is, let us develop our culture in our own way, or let us make our cultures flourish in our own way. And the indicators that you asked about would really be the indicators of how much vitality there is in the cultures of different local groups, local communities. And the emphasis in the report is very much on how culture is flourishing or not flourishing at the local level, at the city level, outside of it's not being produced or understood in the national framework. That's the emphasis of the report.
Okay, will be very. And para terminar, ¿cuál es su experiencia personal de este recorrido de 30 años de 82 a Hangzhou? ¿Cuál es su percepción? ¿Cuál es la sensación de lo que está pasando con cultura?
Very definitely the centrality of culture, both in substantive terms as a major part of the societies and the material frameworks in which we live, that has grown by leaps and bounds. That's linked to technology and globalization. And epistemologically speaking, the cultural has become a lens, a perspective, in ways that it certainly wasn't yet in 1982. In 1982, it was still perceived as something separate, something important, but it wasn't central in the way we look at the world, understand the world, interpret the world, and locate ourselves in the world. And that has been a huge progress.
Nevertheless, the article number 1 of the declaration that states culture as a form of being in the world.
Yes. Okay, well, there was a lot of good rhetoric in the declaration that was ahead of its time. That is, there were people who believed that already, maybe even 10 years before. But it was not something that was shared as widely as it is today.